ポケット Enix チュートリアル
So the next one I want to talk about here is grid snap. Using the grid snap tool, this will actually constrain movement, rotation, and some other transformations based on more precise increments. So to see the grid snap in action, I'll go ahead and click on the sphere to select it, and then I'm going to rotate this sphere along the z-axis. So I'm going to use my right mouse button and click and drag, and you will see that as it rotates, it is rotating along very accurate increments. It's kind of, if I go fast, you can see it's kind of stuttery like that. And looking on the bottom of the screen, you can actually see that it's rotating in 5-degree increments. You see that right there? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So with the grid snap, that is what this is for. It is rotating only in specified increments. And this is good if you want to rotate an object or even move an object with precise coordinates. So if I turn that grid snap tool off, and now when I rotate this along the z-axis, you'll see it rotates a lot smoother, and that's because it's not constrained. You look on the bottom there, you can see it's rotating along the z-axis, but it's not snapped to certain coordinate increments. You want grid snap if you want something very accurate. If I wanted to rotate this object 45 degrees, doing that manually with grid snap off can be quite a challenge. As you can see here, I need to move the mouse ever so slightly, and even still, it's hard to get 45 there. I turned the grid snap on though, and I tried to rotate, and it's easily doable, just like that. I rotated 45 degrees exactly. Or maybe I wanted to rotate this 90 degrees on the y-axis. I can do so with grid snap very easily. There you go, negative 90 degrees. This also works with the move tool, so I have my grid snap active, and I move along the x-axis here. You can see on the bottom it is moving position, and it's moving by one coordinate. Turn grid snap off, and you can see the position is moving without constrained coordinates here. Another feature of grid snap is that you can adjust the parameters of the snap to grid tool. So if I go to options and go to right here where it says grid, open that up and I'll get a menu here. So in this menu here, we see on the bottom where it says snap to grid, we have some options here. This first one enables spacing. I can change that value to something like 3. If I click OK, and I have my grid snap tool still activated. So let me try to move this sphere along the x-axis again. And you'll see on the bottom there, it's moving in increments of 3. See that there? Negative 3, 6, 9, 12. Let's go ahead and change that to a higher value actually. If I put enable spacing to something like 10, this will move it in increments of 10 coordinates. You see that there? This also works for the y-axis. So even if I put it to something like 20, and you'll see it will only move in increments of 20 along the grid. Going back to these grid options here, let's put the spacing back at 1, but right here where it says enable angle, we can go ahead and switch that to something like 20. And if we do that, we'll select the sphere and rotate it along the z-axis as before. So right click and drag with the z-axis selected. And now you'll see that we are rotating in increments of 20. Before we were rotating increments of 5. Besides moving and rotating, grid snap also applies to the scale transformations. So if I select the scale tool and select the sphere and try to scale it, click and drag, you'll see that it will scale along these precise coordinates here. This even works for non-uniform scale in either axis, as you can see here. This is what the scale looks like with snap to grid on, and if I turn snap to grid off, this is what it looks like. This scaling also works with the grid options that we played with before. If I put enable spacing to something like 5 here, click OK, and then we try to scale that sphere just like before, you'll notice it will only scale in increments of 5. As you can see on the bottom, scale factor is 1, 1.5, I drag a little more, 2, 2.5, 3. You get the idea. So the hotkey for grid snap is actually Control G, and this can be very useful to remember. The grid snap tool is also used for when you're creating an object. Let's go to Options, Grid, and we'll enable spacing to something like 7 here. Click OK. Turn the grid snap tool on. Now when I drag and try to create a sphere, you'll see that it will be created in increments of 7 as I drag it along. You can see on the bottom there, it starts at 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, and so on. If I turn that grid snap off and try to create another sphere right here, you see that it creates more smoothly. That's because it's not bound by those constrained integers that we defined. You can see the diameter on the bottom is in decimal numbers there as I drag. To check this, I can double click, and right here on parameters where it says diameter, we have 31.226. But if I click on this one, the diameter is a solid 49, which is a multiple of 7 that we defined in our grid options. This also works for cubes. If I turn that grid snap on and I try to make this rectangular solid, you'll see that it's only drag creating in multiples of 7 on all of the axes. Whereas if I turn that grid snap off and try to create another rectangular solid, I can do it freeform however I want. So grid snap can be applied to operations like rotation, scale, and movement, as well as any parametric shapes or meshes that you create.